Uh, Governor Busbee, since your public career is better documented than your private life, let's begin with your childhood and family background. What are some of the most vivid memories of your early years?
Well, I was raised in Vienna, Georgia. My mother was Nell Deacle from Ocklackney, Georgia. She was a school teacher in Vienna at the time she met my father. My father had been widowed for several years when he met my mother. He had no children by his first wife, and they married and had 5 children. I'm the second of these 5 children. My father was a farmer. He had a large farm out from Vienna. He was a horse trader and mule trader and sold the most mules of anybody in South Georgia. But when tractors came along, it kind of put him out of business. He was also a builder. He built a lot of houses. He built most all of the churches, all of the schools in that area of Georgia. And I have very vivid recollections as a child with the horses, with the mules, and with the various construction projects that he had, and just generally growing up in a small community as one of 5 children.
Did you actually live in the country or in town?
I lived in Vienna, a town of about 2,000 people at the time.
Was your family what we would call a close family?
We were a very close family. I had an older brother. I had twin sisters that were 2 years younger, and a younger brother that was 5 years younger than I was. And my mother died when I was 15. That was in the year 1944. So as a result of that, we were a very close family. My mother had a sister, Sadie Mae Guest, who was married to Nick Guest, and they lived in Thomasville. When my mother died, she had lockjaw from a very minor operation, a very unusual death. She knew that she was going to die in a matter of 4 or 5 days, but was completely rational. When the doctor told her that she was going to die, she sent for her sister, Sadie Mae Guest, who had no children, and asked her to move to Vienna and raise us. My father was quite elderly. He was born in 1872 and was very much older than my mother and was not equipped to raise us. So my aunt moved into the family home and did raise us. And my uncle, Nick, he came on the weekends until he retired. I left home when I was 15 and went to Georgia Military College, where I finished the last year of high school. I continued there for another quarter, and then I went to Abraham Baldwin and stayed there for 2 quarters before going to the Maritime Academy at Pass Christian, Mississippi. I only stayed there for a few months before I decided I didn't want to be in the maritime service. I'd rather be in the United States Navy. My father was the chairman of the draft board, and my older brother and I were kind of the objects of everyone that would look and see how big we were, and we were not in service. But I was not old enough to be in service. My brother had volunteered at the age of 17 to serve in the Navy, and my father suggested at the age of 17 I should volunteer to serve in the Navy, which I did. I entered the V5 program of the Navy to be trained as a pilot. I went to the Naval Air Station at Memphis for training, and from there they sent me to Duke University, where I was in school for 3 years in the V5 program studying engineering. I left the Duke University and went to the University of Georgia. At the time, they did not have enough space at Athens to accommodate all the veterans returning from service, and so I was sent down to Savannah on one of the military bases there, where they had an extension of the University of Georgia. I stayed there 2 or 3 quarters, and then went to the University of Georgia and studied business in the School of Business Administration. I met Mary Elizabeth Talbot from Ruston, Louisiana, in Athens. She had already finished college at a very early age in an accelerated program in Ruston, Louisiana. She went to New Orleans and became a medical technician, left there and went to Athens to work at Athens General Hospital to run the medical laboratory. And it was the courtship that resulted in Athens. It resulted in our marriage, and we were married in 1949 as soon as I graduated from college in June, and before going to law school in the following September.
Let's go back to your family a little bit more. I gathered that you had a rather close family, and a lot of Southern families have family reunions periodically. Was yours of that type?
Yes, well, we didn't have the family reunion where you had second and third cousins, but as far as my brothers and sisters and their children are concerned, and some of my first cousins, we were very close, and we met not just once a year, but many times during the year.
And you actually grew up in the small town, but I guess had a lot of activities in the country too.
Yes, I really did have a lot of activities. As a child, my older brother and I delivered newspapers, the Macon News and the Macon Telegraph. They would, Macon Telegraph would come on the Greyhound bus early in the morning, and we delivered the papers in the morning, and then we would go to school. Early on in my education, in the first and second grades, I would ride a Shetland pony to school. I have very vivid memories of this, and later on I got rid of the horses and ponies and got a bicycle, and I can remember vividly delivering the papers in the morning, going to school, playing basketball in the afternoon, and then going to meet the bus again in the afternoon and delivering the Macon News.
Do you like farm work, or are you one of those that prefer the city?
Well, I'm very much indebted to the farm for causing me to have an education. When I was discharged from the Navy, as I left Duke University from the V5 program, I went back home, and they had a program then called the 5220 Club. That was for veterans for 52 weeks could get $20 a week. When I returned home, my father asked me what I was going to do, and I said nothing. I'm going to join the 5220 Club and just enjoy being home. So he told me that none of our people had ever been on welfare. He considered this to be welfare, and that he expected me to work at the farm until I decided what I wanted to do. And I know at the time they were combining oats, and the machines that they had then are quite different than what they have now. That you would have a chute that had 2 sacks, crocus sacks, and you would have to put these sacks on nails that held them up to be filled as the combine went through the field. And I can still feel the itching that was caused by that oat shaft and my skin hands on those nails, and it only took about 3 or 4 days before I wanted to go back to school. And I would correct something and say I left and went. That's when I went back to Duke, and then went down to the University of Georgia in Savannah at the military base.
Which subjects did you like best in school?
I like physics. I like all the math courses. I think the best that I ever did in school while I was at Duke was in calculus, and I just enjoyed anything that was technical. And I like the engineering courses that I had the most technical courses.
You mentioned playing basketball. Were you interested in athletics?
Yes, we didn't have a football team in Vienna at the time. I played tennis and I played basketball. My older brother was an all-state basketball player, and my twin sisters were both all-state basketball players, and they thought that I would be an all-state, but I was just a mediocre player when it came to basketball, and I never lived up to my family's reputation.
How long had your family lived in the South Georgia area?
My father was born north of Vienna, about 40 miles, in 1872, and he'd been there all of his life, you might say, in Vienna. My mother was raised in Clockney, Georgia, which is about 9 miles north of Thomasville in Thomas County. She came at an early age to teach school in Vienna.
How important were church activities as you were growing up?
My mother was a very, very devout person. She was more or less the anchor of the First Baptist Church in Vienna. So I was a Baptist, Southern Baptist early on. We were raised in the church. I had a vivid recollection of a lady then named Miss Jeannie Forehand. She taught all the little kids at Sunday school. We were vacation Bible school. I could say the books of the Bible, not just forward, but backwards, and I was a student of the Bible due to that one person and my mother. I have very vivid recollections of my mother. We had no welfare programs at the time, and I think she ran a single member welfare agency, because I remember that our family was better off financially than many of the people back then, but I can remember even during the Depression feeding people. I can remember taking food and clothes to people. I remember taking children in our house when the mother died of diphtheria, so she was a great influence really on all of us, even though she did die at an early age and when we were quite young.
It appears then that you were influenced by basically Christian values, shall we say the Protestant work ethic?
Well, I wouldn't say the Protestant work ethic. My father's work ethic influenced us more than anything, and I think it spilled over, and I raised my children the same way. And that is, he expected the boys to work. He didn't expect the girls, my twin sisters, to have to work like the boys, but I started, as I say, delivering newspapers when I was young. I worked every summer. I worked every weekend. I worked in grocery stores first. My brother worked in the drugstore. And for about the last 2 years, 3 years before going to Georgia Military College, I worked at the Chevrolet place, rebuilding engines and working on automobiles. And so that work ethic was something that my father instilled.
You received a BBA from the University of Georgia in 1949. Were you planning to go into the business field at that time?
Well, I was very much in love, wanted to get married, and had very little money. And so we had planned to get married and to go to the farm. We had about a 1,000-acre farm, and my older brother was in medicine, and nobody to run the farm, and there was a house already built there that the overseer had moved out of, and we decided that we would like to farm. I was still courting my wife as we were making plans for this in 1949, and early on in 1949 she asked me what you would like to do. I don't think, she said, that you would want to be a farmer except for our marriage. And I don't know what really prompted me to say this, but I said, I think I'd like to be a lawyer. And she said, that's fine. If you'd like to be a lawyer, we'll stay in school and I'll work and you can go to school. My GI Bill expired when I finished college and got a business degree. And so I didn't have any GI Bill of Rights to go to law school with. So she continued to work in the medical laboratory, and I decided I'd go to law school. And so I got a job at law school. I ran the library at the law school from 6 o'clock in the evening until 10 o'clock at night, Monday through Friday. I remember that the pay was 50 cents an hour, or $2 a night, or $10 a week, but that went a lot further than it does now. She had a pretty good job at the hospital, and we were able to make out with some help from my father, who was living at the time.
I guess that's a decision you've never regretted, huh?
No, and including that job, because I think I'm about the only person in Georgia that's read the Nuremberg war trials. I've read everything in that law library, because you don't check out books at a law library. Most of them are reference books, and all I had to do was sit at a desk 4 hours a night. We had classes in the morning and out at noon, so my wife was working. I would stay on campus. I could study in the afternoon. I started writing for the Law Review, and that's where I met Bill Devine, who became my closest friend and whom I later ended the practice with. But he was the editor and I was assistant editor of the Law Review, and so we'd work on the Law Review in the afternoon and get up our lessons, and then I would go to the library at night, and it was very beneficial.
I recently interviewed Governor Sanders and Governor Arnold, and both of them also attended University of Georgia Law School. Governor Sanders said it was easy, and Governor Sanders finished pretty quickly. What was your impression of the academic level of the law school?
Well, I thought it was hard at the time, but as I reflect back and I compare today, it was not a difficult task, and anyone that studied almost could pass if they studied. I imagine we had 2/3 of the freshman class to finish law school, but I thought it was a good law school compared to the other law schools in the South.
Had other members of your family attended college before you?
Yes, my older brother went to Mercer University, and he was in the Navy, came back and went to the Medical College of Georgia. My twin sisters went to school at Mercer University. My one sister, Jane, got a master's degree, and my sister, June, got a bachelor's degree. And then my younger brother went to school at the University of Georgia.
How did you happen to meet your wife?
On a blind date. I was living in a boarding house on Millage Avenue, and the son of the landlady was courting a nurse at Athens General Hospital, and so he asked one night if I'd like to meet her roommate, and I said, well, not particularly, but I will, and did. And that's when I met Mary Beth Talbot on a blind date, and so we started courting and then ended up getting married.
Now, she's from Louisiana, I believe.
She's from Ruston, Louisiana.
What brought her to Athens?
Well, her father was a doctor. He was born the same year that my father was born, in 1872, so she was like me, a product of an older father. He wanted her to be a doctor. She had half brothers and sisters, and a sister by the first wife who died, and she was the only child by her mother. She went to school at Louisiana Tech in Ruston, and decided that she didn't want to be a doctor, and so went into medical technology and went to Charity Hospital in Ruston, Louisiana. In New Orleans, Louisiana, and when she completed a course there was a doctor that said there would be a vacancy when he left Charity Hospital and went to Athens General Hospital in the laboratory, and so she took that job, and that's the way she came to Georgia.
Okay. When you began to practice law in Albany, what was the firm you were with?
What happened at the University of Georgia, I mentioned I worked with Bill Devine on the Bar Review. We studied together in the evenings or in the afternoon, and we decided we wanted to go into practice together. So we made a tour as we were about to graduate of all of Georgia, and we were looking to see how many people they had in the various towns and cities and how many lawyers they had, and then we were trying to find a place that didn't have too many lawyers. Finally, a judge, it was a friend of my father, told me, George, you go find a city that is growing, that is a good business city, and don't worry about how many lawyers are there. Just open your practice and work hard, and you'll be better off. We decided to go to Albany, and we went there in 1952, and Bill Devine and I opened up a practice by ourselves. We didn't have any secretary. We were over a small department store and an undesirable office, which was all we could afford. We had one room for the two of us and a small office that we kept files in. We made a divider with bookcases between the two of us. And both of us were expecting, our wives were expecting a baby. So my wife was unable to continue to work at the hospital down in Albany, and we really had a hard time. We got a job at the Dougherty County checking titles for tax liens for people that had not paid their taxes, and I think it paid us maybe $5 an hour or something like that. I remember we grossed less than $50 the first month we had been open, and if it had not been for the county's tax titles, I don't know that we would have made it on our own. I remember that we had a lady across the hall from us named Mrs. Lassiter that ran a corset shop. So we had a long telephone cord and we ran it to her office, and she would answer the phone for us while we were checking these tax titles. But we began to grow down there, and we had a partner that came in, Ed Wilkin. He came in as an associate and later made a partner, and that was the first lawyer that came in our firm, and that was several years after we had started our practice.
What was the title of the firm?
Devine and Busbee.
Well, evidently business picked up after that slow start.
Yeah, it took several years before we were really successful enough to have a decent office and a secretary, and then we began to add more lawyers. I didn't know anyone in Albany to speak of when I moved down there, and I decided I would join the JCs, which was one of the most active things for young men down there, and that's the way I really eventually got into politics. I became president of the JCs, and we had a political situation in Albany that a lot of people didn't appreciate. And this is what resulted in my running for the General Assembly. Back in 1956, we had a legislator named Stuart Watson. He was a very popular legislator, never had any opposition, and he was in partnership with Paul Keenan. Paul Keenan's father had a lot of automobile parts companies, and Mr. Keenan had a heart attack, and Paul Keenan had to withdraw from the little two-man law firm from Stuart Watson at the very last minute, shortly before the qualifying deadline to run for the legislature. Stuart Watson had already qualified. He would not have had any opposition, but about 2 weeks before the deadline for qualifying, he decided he could not run again for the legislature. Well, we had two families in Albany that had controlled politics. One was the Sheriff Tarver's family, and later he was succeeded by Sheriff Campbell, and that was one segment of the politics, and the other was the county commission chairman, Morris Tift. The Tift family and the Tarver family had been the political factions that had fought battle after battle. And Albany had been just a small town of about 10 or 12,000 people, and it had grown up to about 80,000 people, and most people that lived in Albany were not born there. These people could care less for the Tarvers and the Tifts as far as political factions were concerned. As a result, when Stuart Watson withdrew, he went and told some of the local business leaders that he could not run. And I was sitting in this office, a small law office with Bill Devine, and this group of men came and asked me to run for the legislature. I'd never thought about getting in politics. In fact, when I was in college, I was not even involved in campus politics. So I told them I didn't know that I could afford to run. I didn't have the money to run a campaign with, and they said, well, they would finance a campaign if I would run. Bill Devine said that he could look after what little law practice we had, because we only met for about 2 months or 2.5 months a year. And I said, well, I'd have to ask my wife, because we had small children then. So they agreed that I could run, and I did run, and I had no opposition. So I went to the legislature really for the purpose of getting my name in the paper and getting known in Albany, because very few people had ever heard of George Busbee. Bill Devine and I thought that would help the law practice, and I would just serve 2 years and come home. It didn't work out that way. After I'd served 2 years, I just continued to serve these 2-year terms, and I never had opposition but one time, and that was in the second term. I had a candidate put up by Marvin Griffin, who was governor, and named John Giles, and he ran against me, and it was the only time I ever had political opposition until I ran for governor.
That's an incredible record.
So
You must have done something that pleased the people to stay in that, 9 consecutive terms, wasn't it?
Yes, I served in the legislature for 18 years.
Did you have a political mentor, somebody that really influenced you?
Yes, I had Walter F. George, was a senior senator, along with Richard Russell, representing Georgia. He was from Vienna. His wife, Miss Lucy, was related to my family, and I used to, as a child, when I would deliver his newspaper in the afternoon, sit down barefooted in his office, and so he counseled me even when I was in law school. And he was, I would say, my mentor, not politically, but particularly in education and the practice of law. In fact, when his son Marcus was killed early in World War II, he gave me all of his possessions, and later he gave me some of his law books.
The legislature seems to have been divided into factions at that time. Talmadge faction, the Griffin faction, and others. Were you considered part of any one faction?
No, I was not in any one faction. I was young. I was a very young legislator and rather independent, and that really is what caused me to get the first major statewide publicity that I ever had. Back when Marvin Griffin was governor, I came to the legislature the last 2 years that he was governor. And that's when I had the famous rural roads fight between Vandiver and Griffin. I was not a Vandiver supporter. I was not a Griffin supporter. I ended up taking Vandiver's side in the final vote, but I was a very independent legislator and not identified with any political faction. So when Vandiver was elected governor of Georgia, it was because of my independence that I played the part that I did in the creation of the Sibley Commission.
Tell us about that. That was a big event with the school crisis and the threat of really closing the schools, wasn't it?
Yes, this was back in 1959 when Ernest Vandiver entered office. He had campaigned on a slogan of, quote, "No, not one," end quote, referring that there would be no blacks admitted to our public schools. And this was a very turbulent time throughout the South. Vandiver was elected on this slogan, and of course the Supreme Court had ruled in Brown versus Board of Education and Cooper versus Aaron that the schools had to be integrated. And this was at a time that schools were closing. In Virginia, you had these little white institutes that were being created. You had tuition grants. They had every kind of device to escape the force and effect of these decisions by the Supreme Court. The way I figured in this was the result of the independence that I just said as a legislator. Ernest Vandiver had a chief of staff named Griffin Bell. Griffin Bell came up with the idea, to save face for the governor, that what we really needed in Georgia was to have a cooling off process, because if people could have voted at the time we were experiencing, they would have voted as they did in states like Virginia and Alabama to close the public schools. So Griffin really came up with the idea of creating a commission that would go all over the state of Georgia and hold public hearings, and they would take months and months to conduct these hearings and then make a report back to the legislature on their recommendations. Well, this was a very secret process because they didn't know whether this would work or not, and they didn't want Vanderbilt to take the risk in it. So Griffin Bell wrote up the proposed creation of this commission, and everybody that was appointed to the commission were ex officio members. They knew exactly who these people would be. They wanted particularly to have Judge John A. Sibley, a very prominent person from Atlanta, to head this commission. And so they had to find something that he was the chairman or president of in order to make him the head of the commission. And I've forgotten exactly what they found that he was, but I think it had to do with some alumni association at the University of Georgia. But you had people like the president of the Farm Bureau and others, but they pretty well knew when they came up with this secret proposal that how these people would vote in the end, and that is they did not want to close the public schools of Georgia. So I went home from the legislature one weekend, and I was approached by James Gray, who was the editor of the paper and on the television station in Albany, and he asked me to meet him for lunch. And I met him at the Mary Acres Hotel in Albany, and he outlined this proposal of Griffin Bell after he had sworn me to secrecy, that if I didn't accept it, I wouldn't reveal it, and if I did accept it, I would never, ever let it be traced back to the governor as it being the idea of his administration and the idea of Griffin Bell, his chief of staff. So I took this great oath, and I came back, and they had oiled this with the press. That Charlie Pugh was political editor of the Atlanta Journal, and when I got back to Atlanta on Monday, I was kind of the shining star because I had big headlines on the in the Sunday paper announcing that I was going to introduce this resolution to create the study commission, which was later called the Sibley Commission. The idea worked. They had the hearings, they came back, they made the report. We did keep schools open, and I think the person that really deserves more credit than anyone else out of this was Judge Sibley. He was a great Georgian, and I don't know of anyone else that could have presided over this commission as he did and kept the public schools open. So that was really the first thing that I did in the legislature.
Well, that was an important step. Well, it would have been disastrous for the state to close down the public schools at that time.
Well, it was kind of a twist of fate, too, because later on, when I left the governor's office, Griffin Bell became he was a partner here and then became a judge and then the attorney general and came back here. And when I came out of office and went with King and Spalding, he became one of my partners. Another twist of fate in the legislature also has to do with another partner that I have now named Charlie Curbo. And it was an interesting event while I was serving in the legislature that caused Jimmy Carter and Curbo to meet. And this was not in my role as a legislator, but as a lawyer. Back in 1962, Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer down in Americus, Georgia. He had served on the school board down in Sumter County, and he was kind of liberal with his ideas, they thought at the time, because he was not as prejudiced on race as many of the people living there, and he wanted to have a public school system. Rather than to take the private school route, he wanted a public school. But in any event, he decided that he would run for the state senate in 1962. So he ran, and we had the most prolonged and most publicized contested election that we've ever had. And it drew together a lot of people that later became governor, attorney general of the United States, president, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and a Justice of the Supreme Court. But what happened when Carter ran against Homer Moore, who was a farmer, a very wealthy farmer down in that area, there was some fraud involved in a precinct in Quitman County in Fort Gaines, Georgia. When the votes were tallied, the last votes to come in, I believe, were in Fort Gaines, and they had some absentee ballots, but the last ones to be counted, and by the time they were counted, Carter had lost to Homer Moore by just a handful of votes, which was really influenced by the number of fraudulent votes that were cast in that election. Joe Hurst was a sheriff, and what he was doing was really trying to control the local election. They had a reputation down at Fort Gaines of always having fraud in the local elections and ballot stuffing and things of that nature. Later talked with President Carter and Charlie Kerbo and Homer Moore about this, and they never, no one ever suspected that Homer Moore had any part in this fraud, but he benefited from it because Joe Hurst looked at both Jimmy Carter and Homer Moore and decided that Homer Moore looked more like a South Georgia farmer, and he related to him better. And though neither were friends of his, he caused the ballots to be marked in the senatorial race for Homer Moore. At the time, Carter decided he would have to contest the election. He employed as his attorney Warren Fortson, who was a brother of the Secretary of State, Ben Fortson. Homer Moore employed Jesse Bowles, who was a lawyer from Cuthbert, Georgia, that was later on the Supreme Court. They began to do battle, and it was a long series of battles in court before the State Democratic Executive Committee, before the County Democratic Executive Committee in Fort Gaines, and court hearings all over South Georgia. The first Superior Court judge to hear this was Judge Carl E. Crow. He was a senior judge on the district, oldest senior judge on the district next to the senatorial district, and under the law he was one to hear it. He ruled against Homer Moore. The fraud was quite evident there, and they were trying to throw out the precinct in Fort Gaines because of the fraud, which would have resulted in Carter's election. Well, Homer Moore decided that he wanted to, after talking with Jesse Bowles, to get me to try this case. And so when they hired me to try the case down in Albany, Albany was a big city for southwest Georgia, Carter thought that Homer Moore had hired a city lawyer, so he'd best hire one. So Warren Fortson suggested they come to Atlanta, come to King and Spalding. That's where he met Charlie Kerbo, and so we litigated and litigated and litigated, and finally Judge Marshall ruled because of a case I had found the night before we argued the final case in Americus. Well, it was in Leesburg, that you could not throw out one precinct. So he ordered us to his chambers room right before the election and ordered both names removed from the ballot and let them run in the general election. And so that's had a twist of fate, because Judge Marshall became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I became governor, Carter became president, governor and then president. Griffin Bell became Attorney General of the United States, and so a lot of things came out of that one race.
That's amazing. I guess there was then another election, the general election.
Yeah, and Carter won in the election. I won the legal battle, but my client lost the election.
Interesting to speculate if Carter had been defeated in that case.
Well, that would have been the end of his politics.
How about that? You got the title Assistant Floor Leader in, 1963. What does that position entail, and how did you get it?
Well, the position would vary by the governor at the time and how much he used his floor leaders. At that time, we didn't have a majority floor leader from a party, like a Democratic Party was a majority, and a minority floor leader like you later had. And so the strength of the position depended on the governor. When Carl Sanders was elected, he had strong support from Arthur Bolton. I really had very little to do in the election. I voted for him, but I was not a strong supporter. At least I was not as active as Arthur Bolton. He made Arthur Bolton the floor leader, and I was one of the 2 assistant floor leaders to Arthur Bolton. I worked very closely with Carl Sanders as an assistant floor leader and became a very close friend of Arthur Bolton. Arthur served first 3 years as a floor leader, and Carl Sanders appointed him to the position of Attorney General. And at that time, he appointed me as his administration floor leader in 1966. The administration floor leader was you might say, the floor leader on just about everything. I handled the budget, I presented the budget, and I did everything that the majority leader that we have today does.
It's the key position for getting the governor's program enacted into law.
Right. You got the governor's program through. The governor still has a floor leader that's charged with trying to get his program through. But in addition to that, the administration floor leader worked with the speaker, like I did with George L. Smith, then the speaker, and I handle everything, you might say, from the legislative viewpoint as well as from the executive viewpoint. Later, this was separated. Now, I served prior to that time as floor leader. I served as chairman of the Judiciary Committee, where I was quite active, chairman of the Rules Committee, while I was administration floor leader, so that made a lot of power in the floor leader's position. Another thing that I did was I headed up the reapportionment effort when the courts mandated that we reapportion. I headed up this effort.
Is that under the Sanders administration?
Yes, and that's when we did away with the county unit system.
Well, let's get into that. That was a very controversial matter, and I know there were strong feelings on both sides about what should be done. As I recall, Governor Sanders insisted that the state really come to grips with this situation and do it rather than having the courts.
Well, no one, right, because what we had to do is, by the redoing the districts, we had to mandate that a lot of people that were in the legislature go home and never come back again. So no one thought that the legislature could do it. We had hearings all over the state, about like the Sibley Commission had them on the schools, we had on reapportionment. And we did come back. We were successful in passing a reapportionment. It was upheld by the courts, and so I think it was a very significant thing for the legislature to be able to do it themselves, where many states failed.
What was the size of the legislature at that time?
I'm trying to think. The debate was when we lowered it down to 180. I can't remember the exact number that we had. I think it was 195, but I'm not sure.
And that's the last time it's been reduced. It's still 180.
Right, it's still 180. It's never been changed.
In your view, is that the right size? Is it too big or too low?
I think at 180 would be about the right size to have all segments of Georgia represented. I think in the urban areas that you could have fewer representatives, but if you did, you go to rural areas and the geography is just too much area for one person to represent and be in touch with the people. So looking at the rural area and the urban area, if you're going to have a true apportioned legislature based on population, which we have to have, then I think it is approximately the right size.
And now this reapportionment applied to the House. The Georgia Senate was also reapportioned in this same general period, and so were the congressional districts.
That's correct.
Did you have?
I was very much involved in the senatorial as well as in the reapportionment of the congressional districts. We had a major battle on the reapportionment of of the congressional districts. And Sam Nunn was a young legislator, and Carl Vinson was retiring, and we had two plans for reapportionment. Someone had to get hurt, and Sam Nunn was trying to create a district that he could run out of, and this would be where Milledgeville in that area and Warner Robins would have just more or less a rounded configuration that would take in the counties that he thought he would be the strongest in. This also included Emmanuel County, where the Speaker, George L. Smith, was from, and so they supported one plan, but under that plan it would make the district that I was from in Albany go all the way from Alabama to the Atlantic Ocean. So I did not have any intentions of running for Congress, but I just had local pride, and so I battled on the other side. We won by one vote. I remember the night that we won, that Sam Nunn just decided, well, I'll just run for the United States Senate. And I told him at the time I thought it was foolish. Nobody knew who he was, and he ran and he was elected. And so I tell him today, by opposing his district and making him run for the Senate, that I take credit for his election as one of our great senators.
Who were some of the prominent people in the legislature at that time that played a leading role in the apportionment, either for it or against it?
Well, Arthur Bolton was very active. He was from Griffin, Georgia. George L. Smith, myself, Maddox Hale, who was the Speaker Pro Tem. I would say we had the most active part.
The county unit system had been in effect for a long time and had certainly been a dominant factor in Georgia politics. Were you glad to see it ended?
Yes, I think that it was so badly apportioned that you really didn't have any representation in your urban areas. I thought that maybe that you could have some more representation in the Senate, like we do in the United States Congress, but of course the court said that you could not, and explained why. So we have a true apportioned legislature based on population for both the House of Representatives and.
During your years in the legislature, you served under a lot of different governors. I guess you started under Griffin, and then Vandiver and Sanders, Maddox and Carter. How would you compare their styles of leadership?
Well, Vandiver, well, first Griffin was in a different era. I was a young legislator. I only served 2 years. I was not in a position of leadership during the Griffin administration. So I don't know that I would be in a position to judge leadership. It was just raw politics, and I mean rough back then. Some of this held over until in the Vandiver administration. The Vandiver administration had a lot of people that were brought into government, but at the same time a lot of people that were political. It was more political climate at the time he was governor. I think a big change began to come about in the Sanders administration. He did something that was almost unheard of, and was unheard of, and that is that he decided he wanted to have a strong executive branch of government. And the only way that you could do this would be to take some of the power away from the legislature that existed through having such a strong speaker that was independent of the governor. George L. Smith, whom I'd worked with for years, was a very, very strong and independent speaker. Carl Sanders decided he would run George T. Smith, who later became Speaker, Lieutenant Governor, now on the Supreme Court, and won. And so at that time you had a legislature that was controlled to a large extent by the governor's office. It made Carl Sanders extremely strong as a governor and dealing with the legislature, to have a person he was close to as Speaker of the House, and really gave the governor additional power through appointment of committee chairman through the Speaker. So that was a very strong period from the governor's or the executive department standpoint as compared to the legislature.
So you're saying that Griffin and Vandiver really did not have that much direct control over the legislature?
Yes, where their control came from, though, particularly back in Marvin Griffin's days, I mean, it was political, a lot more political patronage and through that type thing, and they used influence. Vandiver, it was becoming more modern. You had reapportionment. You had the reapportionment itself changed the complexion of the legislature. I think reapportionment changed the complexion of even in the governor's office, because he was able to deal with an apportioned legislature that was better balanced than what we had under the old malapportioned legislature.
And Sanders was more urban-oriented than his predecessors.
That's correct, and I think it's for that reason. Now, when Maddox was elected, this was a fluke, because he was elected by the legislature. This was the next time that I got a lot of political prominence because of the unique position that I was in. When Maddox didn't, no one had a majority of the votes, the legislature had to cast the ballot to elect the governor. Well, when Maddox was elected, he didn't have any strength in the legislature, and so at that time, the leaders in the legislature, including myself, thought we would organize an independent House of Representatives, and we did. We said we'll elect our own speaker, we'll elect our own majority leader, minority leader, and we will be the force to deal with, and did. During the ballot to elect the governor, I voted for the Republican candidate, Bo Calloway. The reason I did, Albany, my district in Dougherty County, voted 3-1 in favor of Calloway over Maddox. Well, at the legislature, when we first met that year, and before voting for governor, we organized, and I was elected the majority leader for the Democratic majority. And so when I cast my ballot for Calloway, the next morning they called a meeting of the Democratic caucus, and it was a move made to expel me from the position of majority leader because of that vote that I had cast. But I survived that and went on to become majority leader.
Well, that was a key factor in the growing legislative independence that we have today, it seems to me. And has any governor been able to really reassert the kind of power that Sanders had?
It depends on the individual governor as to how much, I won't say power, but how much ability he has to get his programs through the legislature and to work with the legislature. When Jimmy Carter became governor, he wanted to reorganize state government, which I supported. And he had a very difficult time because I don't think he had a personal relationship with the legislature that I had or some of the other governors had. He was a very dedicated and very hard-working person, but he really didn't cultivate any relationships in the General Assembly. He had served in the state Senate. He didn't know any of the House members and really didn't go out of his way to, become good friends and build support within the legislature. He wanted to just pass his program on merit. When I succeeded Carter, I knew early on that if I was going to do some of the programs that I wanted to do, I had to get along with the legislature because they were going to elect their speaker. And I did do that. I'd like to go back and say, though, about the speaker's position. That was the next thing about my being governor that came up, that I really reached a fork in the road, not knowing what to do. George L. Smith was the speaker, and I announced for governor while he was speaker. Early on, I had a lot of opposition. I think about 13 people running against me. I had only about a 9% name identification, and George L. Smith had a stroke. I remember that I had just started my campaign for governor, and many people thought that when George L. Smith died, that I would give up running for governor and try to become speaker. He died on December the 9th of 1973 after being unconscious for many months after suffering a stroke. But I had to decide very quickly that I did want to go on and run for governor. In fact, Bill Devine, my law partner in Albany, said, go on and run for governor, lose, and come on home and practice law. And I think it's what most people thought I was going to do.
Let's go back to some of the other governors. What about Maddox and his style of leadership and relationship with the House?
Maddox had no relationship with the House. I mean, I remember he called us into a special session when he wanted to raise the sales tax, and the session lasted 2 days when adjourned went home. He really didn't. He did not have a working relationship with the House. He really didn't try and utilize all the power that you can have as governor, with line item vetoes and with other power that the governor has. So he never really asserted the power that you can accumulate as governor.
Was it a matter he really didn't understand that power, having no experience?
Well, he had no background in it, and he just didn't work with the legislature.
Well, that in turn enabled the legislature to assume more independence of the governor.
I tell you what, Jimmy Carter, when he inherited, not inherited, but when he was elected as governor, he had to kind of rebuild this, and then I had to continue to rebuild after him, because the legislature became completely independent and during the Maddox era.
Well, you also served under Speaker George L. Smith and George T. Smith. Were there any others during your 18 years?
And Tom Murphy.
Tom Murphy.
Right.
How would you assess their leadership?
Well, all three were very strong. The difference would be in George T. Smith, because he had to show his allegiance to Governor Sanders, because Governor Sanders really elected him. He gave him full credit for doing so. But as far as George L. Smith is concerned and Tom Murphy, they were not elected by a governor. They are independent, and both very strong speakers. George L. Smith had the reputation nationally as a strong speaker. Tom Murphy has a reputation nationally as a long speaker. I worked as a legislator with George L. Smith. I worked mostly as a governor with Tom Murphy, so I worked with them in different roles.
If you had the power to restructure the legislature in any way, what changes would you make in it?
Well, you mentioned the powers of the speaker. I think when they start off, that's great. That's about the proper balance. But as they stay there, they accumulate more power and more power. I really think that I'd like to see the legislature still be independent, as it supposedly is today, but with less authority from the presiding officer. I think that each individual member should have more power. You should still have legislative independence. At the same time, I think that you need a strong speaker. I think you need a strong lieutenant governor. And politics has always been a pendulum. It just swings back and forth. So I'd like to see the pendulum swing back just a little bit to where the individual members were a little more independent of the presiding officer. And yet I'd hate to see a milquetoast type speaker. I want to see somebody that's strong like Murphy or like George L. Smith, but at the same time a little more independence of the members.
Well, is there any structural reason why they can't be independent?
No, there's not, and I don't know of any structural change that I can make, because they're elected by secret ballot. That is, the speaker's elected by a secret ballot. So if you had strong leaders that would challenge him, maybe there would be a little more independence of the legislators. But I know Al Burris ran against Tom Murphy, and he lost. And it took him years before he got over the scars that he got out of that battle. But you just don't have anyone now that's going to assert themselves. That's not a major change. I don't know of any structural changes that I would make.
Now, were you satisfied with the size of the House and the Senate?
Yes, I have no problem with the size of either.
And with the 2-year terms?
I think that on the 2-year terms that because of the size of the senatorial districts under the reapportionment, maybe they should serve 4 years and the House 2 years, but I don't have any strong feelings there.
What about the length of the sessions, the 40-day sessions?
You might eventually have to add 5 or 10 days, but as I look about the nation and I see full-time legislators, I never want one in Georgia. I think that they can, through the committee process, they can refine bills, debate bills and committees, and then handle their legislation during a defined session. I would not be in favor of any material increase in the length of the term.
In Georgia, the lieutenant governor runs independent of the governor. Would it be better, in your judgment, if he ran as a team with the governor, like the president and vice president?
I think not, and the reason is that if the governor was to have a lieutenant governor running as a team, it would be less independence of the state senate than it is now. You can't really compare the lieutenant governor of Georgia with the vice president of the United States, because the vice president of the United States doesn't preside day by day and have the daily contact with the legislative process that the lieutenant governor does in Georgia.
Do you see any reason to give the lieutenant governor any other responsibilities or duties?
Offhand, I don't know of any that I would suggest. It would be nice to be able to utilize a person that's in that office to assist the governor, but I think that will depend on the relationship between the governor and the lieutenant governor. In Florida, they tried to make the lieutenant governor the head of economic development, and I don't think that's worked, because the lieutenant governor really cannot open the doors that a governor can open in economic development and calling on CEOs and presidents of major corporations in this country and about the world. So I can't think of any one thing that I do with a lieutenant governor, except that where a governor gets along with his lieutenant governor, has a lot of respect in him, I think he can assign projects for him to do. But that would just be dependent on the relationship.
So you're quite satisfied with the structure of the Georgia government?
Yeah. I don't know of any organization that I have seen improve more in the period of time that it has than the Georgia legislature. I think the caliber of the people that serve in it are better. They're better educated. They're an independent body. With the minor modification I said about the House being a little more independent of the presiding officer, I don't know of anything I would change. And when I say that, Tom Murphy is one of my closest friends, and I respect him for accumulating power, because it demonstrates that he's a leader. At the same time, you need people in the legislature that are leaders that kind of pull back and let that pendulum rest a little more in the middle.
Governor Carter did a lot of reorganizing of state government, and I believe you supported his changes. What exactly did he change? How effective were the changes?
I think that basically, overall, his reorganization was a great thing for me to succeed him as governor. He caught a lot of flack because he stepped on a lot of toes when you start combining all of these agencies. At the time he was engaged in his reorganization, the first year he was trying to go it alone. He made very little progress, and he finally realized he was going to make no progress. And during his first year, he had a terrible time with the legislature. He lost most everything he had. I remember that Charlie Curbo, who was then Carter's great friend and a friend of mine and a friend of George L. Smith, the Speaker, came over to the legislature and pleaded with us to assist the governor. And I remember George L. Smith telling me that, we're going to look bad if we kill everything that he has. We better help him. And so that's when I became involved. We would go to the mansion on the weekends and work on his reapportionment with him. And then at the second session, we supported his legislation. But we had too many agencies, we had too many boards, we had too many bureaus. We had, I think it was 17 different agencies that were involved in water and air quality in one way or another. So I think it streamlined government. Now, as I will get into about my service as governor, I had one problem, that was in the human resources area. I had to do some restructuring there again, but basically everything that Carter did was left intact.
So it really did make the system operate more efficiently.
Yes, I give him credit for that.
Of course, anytime you're going to change jobs and change the way people do things, there's going to be strong opposition. I'm sure he faced plenty of it.
Well, the opposition he had was from politicians, for people whose jobs were being affected, and for people in government. I think the public supported what he was doing, and eventually he was able to sell it to the legislature with some help of people in the legislature.
Okay. All right, you ran for governor in 1974. At that time, who were your closest advisors and supporters?
Well, when I ran for governor, the closest support that I had when I started my campaign was people in Albany. I had tremendous support at home, but I was not well known out in the state. The two closest supporters that I had were Bill Devine, my law partner that I'd been with since college, and Fred Taylor, who was a client and friend of mine that had a trucking business and a Mack dealership in Albany. He came to Albany with nothing. He became rather wealthy, and he became head of the finances of my campaign and helped me early on. But the person that I turned to that was a great person in his own right in state government was Robin Harris. Robin Harris was the most respected legislator that we'd ever had. And you speak of being independent. He was Mr. Independent. He was independent of every governor and every speaker and everybody else. He was his own man.
He's from Decatur, wasn't
And he was from Decatur. He was in practicing law. Now he's president of Decatur Federal, or CEO of Decatur Federal. I went to Robin, though, and I wanted to get someone whose integrity was just really beyond reproach, that someone that was a leader and someone that I had a lot of trust and faith in to turn my life over to manage in the way of a campaign and to orchestrate the campaign. So I went to Robin and I asked him if he would do me a small favor. He said, "What?" I said, "I'm going to run for governor," and he gulped because he couldn't believe that I would run. But I asked him if he would take off a year without pay and run my campaign, and he became the campaign manager in my campaign. And I suppose if I had to name just one other person, and there were thousands that helped, but if I had to name one other person, it would be the person that handled my public relations and advertising campaign, who was about as well known as I was at the time, and which was very little. Her name was Dot Wood. Dot Wood was in a small PR and advertising firm in Atlanta. It had very little to do in elections, except she was involved in Sam Nunn's election. But I went to Dot Wood and asked her to manage my campaign. And she was able, I think, to with very little budget, to portray to the people over the period of time that I was running a George Busbee that could be elected. And I think she was also able to portray that the principal opposition, which was Burt Lance, portray him as a rich banker and coming out of his bank vaults, and then I was running against Lester Maddox and portray him as a person that was not too serious and rode the bicycle backwards, and to portray me as a great person that had great appeal to old people, young people, black people, everything, and so she painted a picture of me through this that I give great credit to, along with Robin Harris and Bill Devine and Fred Taylor.
Who came up with the slogan, "A workhorse, not a show horse"?
Dot Wood.
That was her idea.
It was her idea, and it worked.
It was a good one, wasn't
It was a very good one.
At the beginning of the campaign, did you consider Maddox to be the front runner?
Well, we had a lot of prominent people that were running at the time. We had Burt Lance, who was running, a very close friend of Carter, being supported by Carter, and I never resented this because they were close friends and Lance had supported Carter. We had Lester Maddox, 100% name recognition, and you would have strong support. David Gambrell came on strong early on. He had been in the United States Senate. I had George T. Smith, the Speaker of the House, and then later Lieutenant Governor, who was also well known. So I really didn't know at the very beginning who was going to emerge. But as it turned out, before the end of the campaign, I knew that the race had boiled down to Lester Maddox would be in the runoff with 13 people running, that he would be in the runoff, and the question became, would Burt Lance or George Busbee be in the runoff against him? And so my opposition was Burt Lance to make the runoff, and the polls were showing that Burt Lance was ahead of me about 4 or 5 percentage points about 3 weeks before the primary. That's when Robin Harris called me in, and I had already lost weight from 208 pounds to 176 pounds, and said if you can extend your work day from 17 to 18 hours a day for the next 3 weeks, we can win. And I was always rebelling as I came in on Sunday night and met with him against his work assignments that he gave me in a campaign, and he would listen to me as I got upset and then tell me what I had to do the next week. And so I did do it, and my family was very much involved in the campaign. It was unlike any other campaign as far as family involvement. My wife and family campaigned separately from me. She ultimately ended up traveling with my older daughter Beth, and then Jan, my second daughter, traveled by herself as far as the family. My 2 boys, they had people that they traveled with separately. And so we campaigned and blitzed the state as a family group, and we got a lot of publicity. We had a strategy in the campaign that was quite different. We didn't have any money, and we had miniature billboards. We would get the farmers to, our organization in each county would get the farmers to allow us to put these miniature billboards made out of scrap lumber, and it was just small billboards like, I think they were about 3 feet by about 6 feet. And we put these all over Georgia, and my family and myself, we would go to every little radio station all over the state. They generally don't have anything but country music, and they were glad to have anybody to talk about anything, and knew very little about politics, but we availed ourselves of that. We went into every little newspaper. We sought name recognition everywhere we went. But anyway, I was still, with all that effort, trailing Burt Lance about 4 or 5 percentage points. And then the timing was right for me, because I was going up and he was coming down with about 3 weeks to go, and finally the lines crossed, and I beat him in the end.
I think you wound up with a little over 20%, and he had 17%.
That's correct. But then I'll never forget the next day. I had 3 weeks before I had to be running against Maddox in the runoff, and I was broke. I mean, absolutely broke. And that's when I borrowed my first money, which I promised my wife I'd never borrow against the house, but did. But anyway, I had a most famous political debate that we had was the one between Maddox and myself. He had debated Bo Calloway once, and Bo Calloway didn't come out too good in the debate. I studied this very carefully. I agreed to debate him and asked to debate him because I thought that I needed to. But I had a lot of people that didn't know whether I could hold my own against Maddox or not in the debate, but it turned out all right.
You say money was a factor. You ran out. How much did the campaign cost?
Well, I can't recall exactly how much it was. We had financial disclosure, so I'd have to verify it, but it would approach between $1.5 million and $2 million ultimately, including the runoff and then the general election. But, you know, after I beat Burt Lance to be in the runoff, I didn't have any problem raising money after that. But it was up until that point that I had a very difficult time raising money. But after I was in the runoff, I didn't have any problem thereafter.
If you're a winner, you do okay. If you're not, it's hard to raise.
Well, I ended up, Sam Nunn and I, along with Tommy Irvin, who was in the legislature in support of Maddox, and later his administrative assistant, we put together money to pay off Lester Maddox's campaign debt that he used to run against me with. So, with the help of John Blackman, another friend of his.
How is the money raised in a campaign like that? I'm sure you have committees.
Well, in my campaign, most of it came out of Albany early on, and then I had some friends that signed some notes for me that I said if I could get started, then eventually we could raise enough money to pay them back, maybe, but not to count on it. And so they signed notes. And then as the campaign progressed, I would get little bits of money from about the state. And I had a few friends that I had made out in the state, and I got some money. But that was the hardest thing for me in the campaign was the lack of finances to get a start. After I started rolling, I was able to raise more out in the state.
Were you able to use television at that time?
No, not early on. I did have television later on. It was a limited budget, but I did have very good television spots that Dot Wood had arranged, and also some documentary film in 30 minutes, I believe, programs. And toward the end of the campaign, that's when I was picking up against Lance, was when we were spending the television budget.
Did you divide the state into particular areas or districts that you should concentrate on?
Yes, I had, for organizational purposes, I had a North Georgia district and a South Georgia. I ran the South Georgia out of Albany and the North Georgia out of Atlanta at the state headquarters. But then what I did is I had in each county in Georgia, I had campaign chairman or co-chairman of persons in all 159 counties. And I ran my campaign through those organizational units.
Well, in Southern politics, the personal approach seems to work effectively, and you got out and met a lot of people, it seems like.
Well, yes, as I say, it was not just me but my family, but they met plant shifts just like I did. At 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, I know my wife would be down meeting stevedores and daylight in the morning in Savannah. I'd be up at a plant shift, one after another, and we put in the hours on that.
What about this debate that you had with Maddox? Was there any particular idea or issue or image that came out of that proved decisive, you think?
I had a lot of discussion and people that didn't agree with my own organization about how to approach this. I decided the approach that I wanted to make was to pursue the theme of my campaign, a workhorse and not a show horse. I think that's what really was catching on. So I came up with the idea that I didn't know exactly what Lester Maddox would do in this debate. I knew that in watching what he had done with the Callaway debates, that he was going to probably shake hands and try and pull me off balance and horse around. But I just said, he had campaigned with pick handles, with T-shirts, with watches and all this stuff and gadgets. And I just thought I'd take some of those on the program with me, and did. And I pulled them. He didn't know what was in this paper bag, but when I started pulling them out, I was really pursuing the theme that I was going to be the serious candidate, the hard work, and not up to a lot of gimmicks like that. And that's more or less the theme that I used on debate, to be a serious candidate.
Well, whatever you used seems to have worked. You wound up with almost 60% of the vote. Maddox 40, and he had 36% in the original primary.
Yeah.
So you got almost all of the other votes.
Well, I'll say this, that immediately after the primary, I went up to meet with Burt Lance, and we pretty well had an understanding that if he won, I was going to support him. If I won, he was going to support me, and he did do this. And of course, a lot of the other candidates did openly support me in the runoff.
Did Gambrell support you?
Yes.
Harry Jackson?
Harry Jackson did not support me. That was a big disappointment, but he had some pledge to Maddox, but I don't think it particularly hurt me. He was not a strong candidate.
Bobby Rowan?
All the other candidates did support me. You mentioned Bobby Rowan. He was the person in the campaign that put the flavor in it to where it made politicking digestible for the public. He could come out with the wittiest things that anyone could do, and he caused me all kinds of problems. He gave me the nickname in the campaign of Kilowatt George, which meant that I was a tool of the Georgia Power Company and the big utilities. And the truth of the matter was that I had the largest award ever made against the Georgia Power Company. I'd never represented him as a lawyer, had no connection whatsoever. And the wife of one of the officials of the Georgia Power Company was Bobby Rowan's campaign manager. But he'd made that term stick, and he gave me a hard time. And when I won and became governor, he said, you know, he did so much for me, he wanted to serve on the Board of Human Resources, and I appointed him as a part of my administration.
And so then you had Republican opposition in the general election. Ronnie Thompson, I believe it was.
Yes, and that was not serious. I never had serious Republican opposition. I had a lot of support from people that voted nationally as Republicans, and I've forgotten exactly what the vote was with Ronnie Cook, but with Ronnie Thompson. But
he got 289,000, and you got 646,000.
Yes, that was not, I campaigned, I don't mean I didn't, but the real race was in the runoff for Lester Maddox and in the primary before that.
All right, as you took office as governor, I'm sure you had some pretty good ideas about what you wanted to accomplish during your 4 years. Had you outlined them in a systematic fashion, the basic thrust of your administration?
Well, I had enough sense to know, having served 18 years in the legislature and seen governors succeed and fail in various projects, that there were just a limited number of things that I could be successful with. And so I think I did one thing right in my life, and that was to try and give priority to something that really needed to be done in this state, that I had a reasonable chance of success with, and to concentrate on those two areas. And I had really used this theme in my campaign and just put it in place when I became governor. And that was that I was going to champion two causes in the state. One was education, and the other was economic development. Both came really out of things that happened to me early in life that we've previously talked about. I went to school at Vienna High School. I remember we had 3 or 4 test tubes, one of which was broken for chemistry. I mean, it was really a very mediocre education that I got, and I was above average as a student. But when I went to Duke University, I said at the time that when I looked at boys from Brooklyn and from here in Atlanta, from Tech High and Boys High, that I was fully 2 years behind everybody that I was in school with. And the kids in this state were not getting a quality education. And if that was going to be the product of Georgia education, we were not going to be able to compete with other states, children from other states. So that was a very high priority with me. I saw very limited job opportunity. Having come from Vienna, and I could see agriculture was not going to support the state. We had textile mills. We really didn't have the job opportunity for people that graduated, that went on and finished their education, had very few job opportunities here. Most everyone I grew up with left home to seek job opportunities. So the second thing that I wanted to emphasize was economic development. And it was those two things that I campaigned on, and it was those two things that I worked hard at as governor.